As we continue on with our free agency preview, we take a look at the Denver Broncos quarterback position. We look at free agents that are set to become unrestricted free agents, and we take a look at the open free agency market with several veteran names that are out there. What should the Denver Broncos do? That becomes a focal point of today's episode of the show, plus much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back into a brand new episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked on NFL Network, your team every day from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. Both of us, we cover the Denver Broncos for the Locked on Network and 9 News. You can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcast. You can watch us here on YouTube in video format. All you got to do is hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Turn on notifications if you haven't done so you get access to everything Denver Broncos related all day, every day, all year long. We have you covered, ladies and gentlemen. And once again, Broncos country, thank you so much for making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Sayre, my friend, our free agency preview continues. We take a look at the quarterback position. We take a look at the review, and then we also take a look at who's a free agent. And we also take a look at some of the free agency markets for some other teams, man. I can't wait to break it all down with you.
I can't wait, Cody. I'm excited. I love talking quarterbacks. This is, obviously until the Broncos figured this out, this is going to be basically our number one topic of discussion in Broncos country, isn't it? I mean, until they figure out the quarterback position, we're going to be talking about this every year. So, of course, we are keeping tabs for you, so you don't have to necessarily look up all the lists and everything like that. We're going to tell you exactly who the Broncos need to be going after. If they go the free agent route or the trade route, we'll see what happens, but I'm excited to talk about it.
Well, Broncos country, let's break it down right here, right now. Let's take a look at the 2021 season, the Broncos quarterback position in review. Obviously, we have to revisit a very trying time in Broncos country. Going back to training camp, obviously the Broncos, Vic Fangio, his coaching staff, being asked by George Paton, what do you need to be successful? What do you feel like you need in order to win games this year and to give us a chance to get back to the playoffs? Vic Fangio said, and Pat Shurmur said, we need a veteran quarterback. Let's try to get Teddy Bridgewater. So George Paton went and orchestrated that because that's what the coaches had asked of him. Outside of that, there was this dilemma. What do you do with Drew Lock? Because in 2020, there was the year, obviously, preparing a brand new offensive scheme. You had to deal with COVID. We saw the ups and downs of Drew. Obviously, he had an injury early on in week 2 that impacted him for a couple of weeks. And he came back and he just struggled with consistency and obviously decision-making. What type of Drew Lock would we see coming into his third season in the National Football League? And I think there were a lot of questions coming into 2021 about Drew. However, there was this coined competition term in training camp that really was never a competition. Vic and Pat, they were going with him all along, and I think that really impacted Drew's development. And obviously there's a lot of players, Broncos players too, some I can't tell you about, that are frustrated as to how things happen, and they feel like Drew didn't get a fair shot. However, it is up to Drew and whatever opportunities he does get to put his best self onto the football field to give the Broncos a chance to win. So there's a lot there. So the Broncos, they signed Teddy Bridgewater on a 1-year deal. They brought him in, and look, they got off to a hot start there, a 3-0 start. And Teddy Bridgewater in those 3 games was actually playing well. I mean, he was escaping defenders, throwing touchdowns at Albert O off structured plays, and then just airing it out against the Jacksonville Jaguars. After the 3-0 start, we're like, hey, okay, this is pretty exciting here with Teddy. But then once the Baltimore Ravens game came around, some missed opportunities, some lack of momentum, and obviously the concussion there, it impacted him. And all of a sudden the Broncos found themselves in a very precarious situation. And unfortunately, that's kind of how the season went for them. And Teddy, unfortunately, the experiment with him didn't work out. He did provide some veteran leadership that the team needed, but ultimately the quarterback position, once again, for the Broncos was lacking.
It really was. I think anybody that watched the Broncos this past season and watched every game unfold, you can look at Teddy Bridgewater's statistics and the production and you would say, wow, that was the best season any quarterback has had for the Denver Broncos since 2014. And you might say, well, that was the best season of Teddy Bridgewater's career. And it probably was, statistically speaking. But at the same time, we can look back at every single individual game and we can chalk up, okay, who's at fault for this? Who's at fault for that? I don't know that you can necessarily eliminate Teddy Bridgewater from blame when we're talking about the Broncos' struggles on third down, the Broncos' struggles in the red zone. Remember when Teddy Bridgewater left the Carolina Panthers and he threw Joe Brady under the bus for not practicing red zone situations, and then you get to the Denver Broncos and you still stink in that regard. That was disappointing to see. So obviously when we're talking about just overall offensive competence throughout the course of the season, not much changed between 2020 and 2021. If we're all being really honest about it, let's just be honest about it for a second, Broncos country. We traded Drew Lock's interceptions for Teddy Bridgewater's 3-and-outs or stalled drives or bad red zone performance. We simply traded one thing for the other. It wasn't any better. Look at the points scored. The Broncos had a game in 2020 with Kendall Hinton at quarterback, and in 2017 with an extra full regular season game, you still put up a comparable number of points, which is absolutely unacceptable. So that to me reflects on Teddy Bridgewater as the veteran option that was supposed to be the safe option. He was supposed to have great chemistry with Jerry Jeudy and the tight ends. He was supposed to do this, that, and the other. I don't think we saw really any of that from Teddy in 2021.
And I think it poses the question, would you re-sign him based on what you saw last season? And I think that's a conversation we'll get to coming up, obviously, in our next segment as we talk about Teddy as a pending free agent. But even for Drew Lock, I think you look at his situation, and I think a majority of Broncos country, and this is the wild thing, and I think we got to address it here. But Sayre, in Broncos country, there's this one side of Broncos fans that love Drew Lock. He can never do any wrong. And then there's this other side that, Drew Lock can breathe, and all of a sudden he did something wrong. Like, it is so toxic. Like, where's the middle ground? Like, where is the middle ground fan base that says, hey, look, we can look at Drew. He obviously has to improve. These things he does well. This is where he needs to improve, and he needs to eliminate these things, but he can get there potentially with proper development. That's like the commonality thinking of like, hey, where can we meet in the middle here? Instead, it's split and it's toxic. And I think it's really kind of ruined the outlook on Drew Lock. I think he's worth the continued investment, but I wanted to get your thoughts on that. In your opinion, for Drew Lock, a former second-round pick, now obviously a new regime that has no ties to him whatsoever. I mean, is he worth the continued investment in your opinion?
I think so. I really do. And I know that Broncos country opinions have been so split on Drew Lock, and it's not even just opinions anymore. It's just like total, it's craziness out there. If you go on Twitter and you try to even say anything about Drew Lock one way or the other, you're really setting yourself up. It's like way too many people have taken it personally, the fact that Drew Lock kind of struggled, as a young quarterback. That's really, I think, to me, Cody, that's the biggest shame in all this, is that like Drew Lock is not trying to personally hurt the Denver Broncos by playing the game. I mean, He's going out there, he's doing his best, and we've had some really good moments with Drew as well. So I just feel like, to me, I mean, the timeline of quarterback development, it to me is more subjective than what people are making it seem. It's like if you haven't done this by this amount of games, then you are, I mean, a failed prospect or a failed project or whatever you want to say. So I just personally, for me, if you draft a quarterback, like, I'm not necessarily willing to throw in the towel super fast, unless like with Paxton Lynch, like there's a clear difference to me, Cody, between what we've seen from Drew Lock in 3 years and what we saw from Paxton Lynch in 3 years. With Paxton Lynch, I mean, he was out there. There were times when he clearly had somebody that was coming up to blitz him right off the tackle or right off the guard, coming to blitz him. And he looks him straight in the face, and he calls the play or whatever. He hikes the ball, and that guy just up and hits him. I mean, I remember that specifically in preseason games, and thinking to myself, does this guy even know what he's looking at out there? With Drew Lock, of course, the issue has been recklessness with the football. And I get that. You can't have that. It's unacceptable. But at the same time, I just feel like Broncos country, everybody wants to whine about Josh Allen, and the fact that they didn't draft Josh Allen. But let's be honest, you guys would have run him out of town after one season. I mean, he would have never been able to get away with under 60% completion percentage with Broncos country. Let's just be real about that. So I think that you have to afford a quarterback some development. I would absolutely still keep Drew Lock through his contract and see what he can bring to the table this coming year, whether he's a backup, whether he gets in the mix again. I don't necessarily care about that, but I think that obviously you keep him since he's under contract for sure.
And all options are on the table. Broncos country coming up here in just a moment. We're going to take a look at Teddy Bridgewater. Do you bring him back if you're the organization, or do you let him go? We pose the question as to why or why not, coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about the sponsor. Today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. It's our good friends over there, BetOnline.net. Ladies and gentlemen, BetOnline has you covered this season with more odds and props and lines than ever before as football continues its march through the playoffs and right towards the big game here this Sunday, Super Bowl 56. BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. season. And it's not just football, ladies and gentlemen. BetOnline has up-to-the-minute info on pro and college hoops, NHL, boxing, UFC, along with live real-time updates of current games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2022 season. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, Broncos country, we get into the second half action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. Take a look at the Broncos pending free agents at the quarterback position. Obviously, Teddy Bridgewater is the number one person that comes to mind here. And Sayre right here, obviously, for the report that we had towards the end of the season that we had found out and we had heard about, obviously Benjamin Albright reporting, from Teddy's camp, what they were looking for is he's looking for a destination that's going to pay him $25 million AAV. And that right there, as you mentioned, is Derek Carr-like money here. And when you look at just how he played in Denver, does it make sense? Is it supportive? I mean, if you're combining maybe what he did in New Orleans with everything else, that might be his only market. But I think based on what he did this past season, I can't see it. And I sure as heck can't see the Denver Broncos willing or wanting to have the desire to fork out that type of money for him for that price.
I don't see it either. I mean, that seems like such a hefty price. And I know inflation is happening in the NFL. The salary cap is going up. Quarterbacks get paid a ridiculous amount of money. But man, when you're talking about like right now, just the way that things stand in terms of the way quarterbacks are being paid, I'm pulling up my notes right now because Derek Carr is getting paid $25 million annually on his contract, which by the way, all the talk is that he should either be getting out of it and trying to re-sign with the Raiders or sign somewhere else and get a contract extension. So he's looking to get paid even more money, but he represents, I believe, number 12 or number 14 in terms of like, that's like the bottom of NFL starting quarterbacks in terms of average annual value. So with Teddy Bridgewater, you could justify and say, hey, I'm putting up numbers that's even somewhat comparable with, these quarterbacks that are in this tier. You could consider me 15th or 16th best in the league based on whatever. I don't know. But maybe that's what his agent is going to tell NFL teams. I just don't see the issue right now with Teddy Bridgewater, and the thing that's in his favor is that there's a giant chasm between Derek Carr and the next highest paid QBs. It goes from 25 million to 10 million average annual value with Ben Roethlisberger out of the mix. He was at 14 million average annual value. So that chasm right there, just it creates such a gray area in terms of like, where do you even slot Teddy Bridgewater? Because you can't compare him to the rookie contracts and those guys that are playing well. You can't necessarily even compare him to Derek Carr, who's playing some of the best football of his life. So where do you put him on that level? Do you put him on the Jimmy Garoppolo level, who's making over $27 million a year? So is 25 a discount? I mean, all of these different things are swirling around your head like the beautiful mind or whatever. And it's like, where do you fit Teddy into that conversation? All I know is, Cody, I don't think the Broncos fit into it anywhere.
I honestly have a hard time, Sarah, believing that there is any NFL team out there right now that will pay him that much money. I mean, you talk about even Andy Dalton, 10 million annual average per year. His stat line, maybe his impact is probably around the lines of Andy Dalton. I think that might be a fair comp right there. But man, there is no way that the Broncos should. Like if the Broncos did that, Sarah, like if they paid him that type of money, I would be very worried about the direction of the organization. And I don't think George Paton would do that. While George Paton respects Teddy Bridgewater, it wasn't, obviously he made the trade call to be able to do it. But George Paton didn't do it because George Paton wanted to do it. George Paton made that move because that's what Vic and Pat wanted. He's got no ties to him now. He doesn't have to keep him along. And I think if you're looking for that type of price tag, good luck, because even his production came nowhere near close to what Derek Carr did. I mean, Derek Carr is one of the NFL's leading passers and had a very good year despite all the turmoil, despite the ups and downs. I would take Derek Carr in Denver, honestly. Like, I would pay Derek Carr that money to come to Denver, but, I don't know how Broncos country would feel about that, Sarah. So, I mean, you look at that, the multi-year commitment that, is it worth the price tag for Teddy? In my opinion, probably not, especially as he's on the upper side of being an older veteran quarterback. He's been in the league for quite some time. You know what you're going to get with him. I don't think that you're going to see any more growth from like what he's going to be able to do. I think what you've seen from him now is what you're going to get. And primarily in Denver, I think that's the best version you're going to get of Teddy for the remainder of his career. In my opinion, Sarah, I think he's a good backup. I think he's a solid, reliable backup. But if you need him to start and win games for you, I don't think that's going to be the case.
I don't either. I just don't see it. And yes, you're right. If the Broncos, for some reason, do pay him that, even for a 1-year deal, I just don't think it's justifiable. I think it's borderline. Like we would have to sit here and consider like, man, like everything that we thought about George Paton, was it accurate? Because even George Paton, he could have traded and acquired Teddy Bridgewater for what, 17 million a year or whatever he signed for Carolina, back in 2020. He could have acquired that full contract and said, "Oh yeah, we like him as a high-end backup, low-end starter. We'll pay him 17 million a year." No, George Paton knocked that price down to like 4 million or less. So
Yes.
I mean, just the way that things are currently progressing, we know that the Broncos bought low on Teddy Bridgewater. They kind of bailed the Panthers out in terms of taking even some of his contract on. So I just don't see that being the case. I don't see George Paton making that move. I've been wrong before, Cody. Just don't get the vibe that that's the direction everything's going, especially after the hires they just made. Nathaniel Hackett, Justin Outen, all these different, Clint Kubiak coming in. I just don't see that being the case.
I think younger is the direction, or obviously a veteran guy that the Broncos are going. And obviously Teddy's probably not going to be the right veteran guy fit for what the Broncos want to do offensively. Ladies and gentlemen, coming up here in just a moment, Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we obviously talk about the evident trade targets the Broncos could look at. We talk about some maybe intriguing free agency options as well that the Broncos might be interested in, coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. That's our good friends over there, ladies and gentlemen, at Built Bar. And as you know, it's the best tasting protein bar that is out there on the market today. The bars are covered in 100% milk chocolate. They're soft, they're easy to chew, and they're very delicious, ladies and gentlemen. You can go to built.com today to see the 9 amazing original flavors that they have, plus the occasional limited time flavors. They have some special flavors that they release on a month-to-month basis. Go check out what this month's is over at built.com. And if you need a little bit of extra fuel to help you get through your day, ladies and gentlemen, Built Bars contain 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. For something that's covered in 100% milk chocolate that tastes delicious like a candy bar, that is fantastic value. And you can go to built.com right now. And when you go to checkout, make sure you use promo code LOCK15, and that'll get you 15% off your next order at built.com. Once again, promo code LOCK15 gets you 15% off at built.com. All right, Sayre, jumping into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos free agency preview. Taking a look at the quarterback position. Sayre, obviously, I think the key 2 players we're going to talk about in terms of free agency, the Broncos may not have to sign in free agency, but more so trade for. Denver will inquire strongly on Aaron Rodgers, and the Green Bay Packers contingent upon their decisions. And with Pete Carroll coming back, does Russell Wilson maybe want to stay another year? I think it's going to be an intriguing storyline to follow. And obviously, you have to look at what the Broncos can offer. They have so much draft capital right now. When we talk about first-round picks this year, being able to swap with Seattle, being able to swap with Green Bay, and then giving them back-end assets in rounds 2 and 3, and then even into next year, it gives the Broncos flexibility to get their guy that they want. It depends on if the other organization wants to do it. So there's obviously the 2 guys we've been talking about, Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson. I don't know if last week you got to watch the Pro Bowl skill showdown. Well, watching Russell Wilson throw the football, man, so smooth, so accurate. I'm actually warming up a little bit more to Russell Wilson because obviously you're going to get, I think, longer play out of him. But, man, he's a fun player to watch. Those are the 2 guys here, but we've spent so much time on this show talking about these guys in the build-up throughout this offseason. But let's talk about maybe some other free agent options, some veteran options that could be available out there in free agency.
Absolutely. And regarding really quickly on Rodgers and Wilson, I mean, we've seen Benjamin Albright reporting on Twitter that the Broncos have had a package ready in regards to Rodgers for a year, over almost a year now. So they're ready if and when that time comes that the Packers say, hey, we're ready to trade him. The Broncos are like, all right, here's the offer, So, but the free agency, Cody, is not something that Broncos country has talked a lot about because either you're on the Rodgers or you're on the Wilson or you're on to the draft. But there are a couple of free agents I think that you could keep your eye out for, Jameis Winston being one of them. And of course, like, he gets into Sean Payton's offense and he spends a year there learning, which I think was an amazing move career-wise for Jameis Winston, just to learn from Sean Payton, to learn from Drew Brees. Then you go out and you get the opportunity to start in 2021. And let's be honest, Jameis Winston, I believe he just got beat by Teddy Bridgewater in terms of touchdown passes by like 5. And he only played how many games this last year? So before tearing his knee up. So of course, there's Jameis Winston is not the most mobile quarterback, and he's got a 30 interception season on his resume. But man, he can also light up the scoreboard as well at times. So I like the opportunity to take a chance, Cody, on former high draft choices with high upside, if possible. I think Jameis Winston, if you're looking at a guy who could be a good pocket passer, and I think even in an offense like the one the Broncos are about to have, you don't necessarily need to be a scrambler at the QB position to be effective on rollouts and throwing on the move and stuff. I think Jameis Winston, if he's healthy, I feel like he's going to be a smart acquisition for any team, be it the Saints or somebody else like the Denver Broncos.
Well, let's take a look at a couple of options here too. And obviously for Jameis Winston coming off of ACL surgery, he is going to be a free agent for them. I mean, I'd be hard pressed not to imagine they're going to try to do everything they can to get him back, because I don't think they want to go into the season with Ian Book as their starting quarterback, and let alone the contract they paid Taysom Hill is looking so bad right now. Considering they also paid Alvin Kamara, and they still have Michael Thomas, who has a massive contract. Like, it is a mess right now in New Orleans. But a name to throw out there, a couple names here: Mitch Trubisky, the backup quarterback to Josh Allen in Buffalo. A lot of people have talked about, hey, Mitch, he looked decent in the preseason. However, look, I think for Mitch, I think that in that system, what we saw in particular with Matt Nagy's offense, how much of that is really on Mitch Trubisky versus how much of that is, maybe ineptitude on his part. I think a lot of it, you could probably put the equation on Matt Nagy's offense and scheme and the struggles that they had when he tried to control the play calling, because every quarterback that they had really struggled. It didn't matter if it was Nick Foles, didn't matter if it was Andy Dalton, or even Justin Fields, the rookie that everybody in Broncos country at first was so mad that George Paton passed on. He didn't look that great, obviously, in Matt Nagy's system as well. So I think it's something to consider here. But Mitch Trubisky, obviously, with the Buffalo Bills, looked good behind Josh Allen. I just imagine that they probably do not want to let him go. And I don't think he'd necessarily want to leave Buffalo in the situation he's in, because, look, they're close there. They're a legitimate Super Bowl contender, and they might get there next year. A lot's very contingent upon what they do this offseason. Obviously, the loss of Brian Dable is going to be interesting. How much of it was Dable and the progression and evolution here of a guy like Josh Allen versus Sean McDermott? I mean, everything's going to be very interesting. Ken Dorsey's now the OC there in Buffalo. But then let's talk about another guy who played for the Las Vegas Raiders, Marcus Mariota. And Sayre, look, I've always been a big supporter of Marcus Mariota. I watched him all at the University of Oregon. I got to watch him multiple times in person when going to the games at Autzen Stadium. And I tell you what, like, he just has this skill set to him that maybe in this offense where outside zone, you're running that kind of that outside handoff, you're running stretch plays where your offensive line is trying to seal and get the edge. Just imagine the play action right off of that. Marcus Mariota might be the guy for that. That's kind of what he did with U of O. So I'm not opposed to either of these two guys here, but I think the price tag would be interesting. Marcus Mariota was one of those guys last year. I think everybody was watching like, hey, what's he going to do in free agency?
Yeah, and he should be again this year, right? I mean, ironically, if teams are looking for the next Ryan Tannehill, maybe you do look at Marcus Mariota. I mean, that's just the irony of this whole situation. I remember the turning point for the Titans. None of us will soon forget it. A 2019 regular season matchup in Denver in which Marcus Mariota got benched in a shutout. And then all of a sudden the Titans became one of the top contenders in the AFC, literally from that point forward. So I think Mariota has had enough time now to kind of observe. He's had enough time to kind of hone his craft mentally and do what he needs to do in that way. And he's shown some splash plays. Obviously, as a runner for the Raiders, we've seen him come out there and make some big plays as a runner. So I've always been high on his skill set, Cody, and I know you have as well, being that, going back to, like you said, watching him at Oregon and playing there. And I think that you combine his big arm and his mobility in an offense like this that doesn't necessarily mitigate responsibility for the quarterback. But at the same time, I do think an offense like this helps the quarterbacks tremendously. Look at Jimmy Garoppolo having a ton of success, going to almost 2 Super Bowls in 3 years with the San Francisco 49ers. Then you look at all over the place with this offense. I mean, guys having way better success in it than out of it. Jared Goff, way better with the Rams than we saw with the Lions this past year, for example. Or even Matthew Stafford, way better with the Rams than he was with the Lions. Kirk Cousins, obviously they worked to get this scheme in Minnesota for him because it was so effective for him in Washington. It helps quarterbacks. So a player like Marcus Mariota, with his talent, he's still a younger guy. I mean, in today's NFL, the quarterback position, if you're under 30, you're sitting pretty because you can play another decade if you're 27, 28 years old. So I feel like, to me, Cody, he would be one of my top options. As like George Paton would say, the dart throw. I would love to get a guy like Marcus Mariota if the Broncos don't make a big time trade.
Well, the next guy too, I have already seen Broncos going to just say no to Tyrod Taylor. Obviously, we've seen Tyrod's growth and evolution. The Chargers, the unfortunate incident with the doctor. I mean, dating all the way back to his time in Buffalo. I mean, you could even go to more recently at the Houston Texans. And look, I think initially when he was in there for the Texans at the beginning of the season, he looked good. Then he hurt his hamstring, and then he missed some time. And then Davis Mills took over, and Davis Mills actually might be the guy there. I mean, I'm not sure how that'll be here, but for maybe like scheme, right? And I think that when we talk about scheme here, ladies and gentlemen, you have to look at the player, right? And you have to look at what the Broncos offense wants to do. Now, I know a lot of people are automatically going to look at Tyrod Taylor or even Marcus Mariota or Mitch Trubisky or Jameis Winston's pass and say, well, because of their pass and we've seen certain things from them, I don't want that on my team. You have to think about the scheme and maybe how that player maybe amplifies and maximizes the scheme a little bit, because look, scheme matters. You can be an average player in a really good scheme that fits to what you're able to do, and you can have a lot of success. I mean, that's where Trevor Siemian's success initially came from, because the Broncos had a scheme with Siemian that was efficient to, I think, what he could do, and obviously his level of cerebral operating. I mean, enough to get to a Pro Bowl there and get all of his teammates like jackets with Skittles in it, like a dispensary there. Outside of that, I mean, I don't know if the Broncos will really take a look at a veteran option outside of that, like with the Tyrod Taylor. I think it'd be surprising to see them make a move for any of these guys. However, I think that if you're going to look at any of these guys, these are probably the names to keep an eye on.
They are for sure. I mean, you could get into backup options all day. Tim Boyle being one of them from the Detroit Lions, had some time with the Packers as well. But in terms of starting quarterbacks, that's what everybody wants to know. And I think the list is very, very slim, So I just think that is it. I mean, free agency this year, there's no Tom Brady, that's for sure. There's no Kirk Cousins. So in free agency, your options are going to be limited. Even to get the top guy, Jameis Winston, you would have to convince him that your situation is better than what he would be leaving in New Orleans, which maybe there's a chance to do that now that Sean Payton's gone. So I don't necessarily know that. But obviously, Cody, with free agency, we know this. It's all about the money. It's all about the green. So, hey, you throw $20 million at Jameis Winston after coming off an ACL, anything could happen. So depending on what the Broncos want to do, I think it's good to keep an open-minded approach. Any of these options have a level of intrigue. It may not be, oh, we signed Marcus Mariota, we're going to the Super Bowl, baby. But at the same time, you just never know what could happen.
You never know, and that's the beauty of the NFL, ladies and gentlemen. It changes every single year. And ladies and gentlemen, let us know as we get closer to free agency. Look, Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we have you covered with Free Agency Frenzy. Once free agency actually happens, you're going to get the in-depth coverage and analysis, all things Denver Broncos that you need here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. But let us know in the comment section if you had to look, if the Denver Broncos are going to look at a veteran option on the free agency market, not via trade, which option would you potentially suggest the Broncos take a look at? I mean, there's no right or wrong answer. It's open for respectful feedback and discussion. We can't wait to interact with you, Broncos country. But that'll do it for today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Tomorrow's episode of the show, both Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we're going to preview the Broncos defensive back free agency room. We're going to look at the free agents that are there, potential free agents from other teams, and maybe the Broncos might pick up the phone and say, hey, let's get on with this agent and his representation and see if he wants to come to Denver. We take a look at that on tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos.